Hi there, my name is Moray and welcome to Moray's Muse, an anti-AI generated history channel. I'm a real woman talking about history. Today we're talking about Tacitus, the famous writer Tacitus who wrote without anger or bias. And that's what he literally puts in the Annals, the incredibly famous work that is commonly referenced. And we're going to be talking about how biased was he really? We'll also be discussing his contemporaries, writers like Varro and Plutarch, whose work we also reference from. I also wanted to discuss whether Tacitus was actually historically accurate of a writer in his own words, and whether he did actually write without bias, or whether he's the best out of a bad bunch. Because 90%, or around 90% is estimated, of classical work has been lost due to things like fires, the Great Fire of Rome, and basically them being written on papyrus, which is a material that doesn't last. It's not like a tablet, is it? So with that all being said, let's get into this video. Let's start with Tacitus's early life and him being born into the reign of Nero. Tacitus is born in either 56 AD or 57 AD during the reign of Nero. It's said he belonged to the equestrian order, and his family possibly originated from southern France or northern Italy. He's educated in Rome, he trains under people like Quintilian, and he gets married to Julia Agricola. His father-in-law is Gnaeus Julius Agricola, so he marries into a good family. I was going to say he's a Nepo baby, he's not, he marries into a good family. A lot of Tacitus's life was under the Flavian dynasty, especially Emperor Domitian, who, yes, not many people like Domitian. Domitian's paranoia at the end of his reign led Domitian to a reign of terror. And this is when many senators were exiled and killed. Tacitus remains in Rome. He continues his service in the Senate. And during Tacitus's service in the Senate, he hates living under the Flavian dynasty. Tacitus is having like survivor's guilt because he's seeing the emperor's crimes, and he believes that he's complicit for even serving in the Senate during this time, so he has a moral compass. The last few years of the Flavian dynasty were not good for his mental health. But it did give him scope into analysing like the corrosive nature of human character, right? He saw people behave in a disgusting way. So yeah, it was very formative for him. So Domitian gets assassinated, yay! And Nerva replaces him. Domitian gets assassinated. The rumor is his wife did it, but like I said, we will be doing a full video on the Flavian dynasty. I think that's the mission for February if we do cover the Flavian dynasty in full on this channel. So Nerva replaces Domitian the same day. Nerva, who not many people talk about, but Domitian going was a very good thing. And Tacitus reaches the pinnacle of his political career under Nerva and Trajan. So much better than he becomes Suffect consul in like 97 AD, and he later serves as the proconsul of Asia, one of the most prestigious things in the empire. And Domitian imposed like an unnatural silence, and I really do feel like Tacitus was quite messed up by Domitian's reign. So Tacitus decides that he's going to document everything. And he documents the history of the Caesars, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So here come the Annals, the events of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He writes, Sine ira et studia, without anger or bitterness. And this is the claim that is central to his identity as a historian. Tacitus says that previous historians of the empire were not historically accurate, and he was going to. Those who wrote throughout an emperor's lifetime were too scared by the emperor to write actually historically accurate. Kind of like how journalists are bought out by politicians. Tacitus argues that histories are biased by flattery or straight up sycophants, right? Tacitus argues that those who wrote after an emperor's death were so jubilant by the death of this person they feared, they wrote with such bitterness because finally the emperor was dead. What could they do? What could the emperor do? The biggest problem is by the time Tacitus writes the Annals, the Julio-Claudian dynasty had been dead for 50 years. So it's kind of like me writing about Woodstock. I don't know. So realistically, could Tacitus have actually written with historical accuracy if it was 50 years after? I can see his point though, that those who wrote during or after an emperor's death would have still been biased. So he thought he was writing with unbiased because it was 50 years after and the truth had settled in a way, you know? The sleeping dogs had lay. I don't know if you know that saying, like, let sleeping dogs lie or whatever, but like everything had just settled. So whilst Tacitus thinks that he is very unbiased and it was kind of part of his branding, modern scholars do not agree with Tacitus. You see, Tacitus writes reporting rumors, multiple interpretations of an event without explicitly choosing one. So he writes in a way where the most sinister narrative is possibly the one you choose. It's kind of like question mark, or maybe that like meme. Tacitus isn't historically accurate. He uses specific terminology, like the term rule, to create this kind of vibe of a monarchy when Rome was not a monarchy. That's the whole point of Rome. There was no monarchy post Caesar, right? Tacitus hates people like Tiberius. I mean, I hate Tiberius from Tacitus' just description of him. And Tacitus, for example, the way he writes about Tiberius, framing him as complex, nonetheless, but hypocritical figures who are corrupted eventually by their power. So realistically, Tacitus' promise that he's impartial doesn't really stand up, but he makes good points. Those who wrote under emperors were too scared to write anything bad, because they'd be killed. And those who wrote after an emperor died were writing in revenge, so it wasn't really their opinion. It was just relief. Tacitus produced 5 major works over his lifetime, and he even wrote a biography of his father-in-law. So Tacitus's main legacy is like the Annals. And he also wrote the histories as well. In my last video, Varro, you can tell I really do not like Mark Antony. And what I was trying to point out in that video was during the Roman Republic, the would-be dictators, the wannabe dictators, would kill and proscribe people who narrated the Rome of their time. However, during the time of the Empire, we see a bit of difference. If you take, for example, Plutarch wrote from Greece to avoid being killed. So he exiled himself. That was like, yeah, that's clever, right? And Tacitus, he wrote about emperors 50 years after, so he wouldn't be killed. So my point is, I was incredibly biased in that Varro video. I really dislike Mark Antony. I really dislike this man. But Plutarch and Tacitus's work survived because, it is my opinion, I'm not a historian yet, it is my opinion, that they didn't have like the direct pressure of having to work and be scared by an emperor. However, another issue we have is, like I said, 90% of documents from the classical era are gone because they didn't have hard drives or satellites.
Even with hard drives, they would be washed out.
Yeah.
So it's just been a long fucking time.
A long time. And if we look at the later books of the histories and the middle books of the Annals, Tacitus's work, a lot of it is still gone. For example, stuff that we are missing right now is detailed accounts of Caligula's reign. Ugh, they really don't like him here. The early years of Claudius, was Claudius actually as big as a simp as people made him out to be? And the final years of Nero. The final years of Nero are gone. Historians have to rely on people like Suetonius, who seems a lot less historically accurate than Tacitus with his promise. But how Tacitus's work did survive. As I have spoken about the Petrarcho, not Plutarch, as I have spoken about in the Petrarch video, the Renaissance, it brought a time of preserving classics. The preservation of manuscripts became of more importance than it was during the Dark Ages. The more a manuscript got written about, and everything got quoted, the more it would be saved and the more it would be preserved. Because if you're quoting and quoting and quoting, you know, it's kind of like live, laugh, love, right? Everyone knows that. But Christianity, or Christus, is mentioned in a lot of Tacitus's work. And even though Tacitus saw Christianity with like aristocratic contempt, it was still mentioned, it wasn't omitted. And that was very useful during the Renaissance. You know, it's why his work was kept around. Tacitus's work throughout the Renaissance was used to teach reason of state. And Tacitus's work was used by Republicans to argue for anti-monarchy. They didn't like the loss of liberty. In Florence, 2 manuscripts survive. Now, Tacitus's work did have a lost and found episode in my grandparents' lifetime. Can you guess what episode that was? It was somebody Austrian, and during the Second World War, Hitler tried to seize one of Tacitus's work, or Tacitus's manuscript that was copied over the years, because of its nationalist value. In conclusion, I feel like Tacitus is seen as a historian of the time who has no bias. But Tacitus in his work, you can see that he has a penchant for drama, as we all do. Tacitus's narrative focuses intensely on great men of the imperial court. Tacitus might have thought that he told history as it actually was, but we all have a bias at the end of the day. And possibly, rather than seeing him as someone who is historically accurate, maybe we can look at him as a man who was like an early psychologist, because that's how he wrote about his subjects. And yes, I believe that I'm not a historian, guys, I'm a history communicator who might be a historian one day. In conclusion, that is my video.